Alright, take 2 on recording this because the first time I did it, I forgot to turn my lighting on. Joys of YouTubing. So 2022's driver transfer season was a bit chaotic. I don't think I've experienced a contract signing period like that in any other sport ever. Just bananas. So thanks, Seb, for that. Gonna miss you, but at least you provided some drama on your way out. Last year, I didn't provide my drivers' predictions until much later into the year when some of them had already been finalized. So this year I figured I'd get the jump on it and do it at the start of the year. But if we need to do a driver prediction to Electric Boogaloo some point later in this year, then I might come back and do it again. But I just do not see this driver market being as insane as last year's, unless Lewis Hamilton out of the blue decides to retire, or even Fernando Alonso. So I guess I'll go through each of the teams in the order of least likely to make a driver change to most likely to make a driver change. So that means that first up is going to be Ferrari. I think that Ferrari are pretty happy with their driver pairing at the moment. Both Carls, okay, that's my new name for the Ferrari drivers. Charles and Carlos are both contracted until 2024, and they're both incredibly competent. Charles, of course, is Ferrari's Il Predestinato. Ferrari is going to want to keep him with their team as long as Charles wants to be there. That is more so a question for him probably after next year on whether or not he wants to extend. So I think this year is going to be very important for that decision for Charles. Carlos, on the other hand, hasn't been quite as strong as Charles. I feel like he has the backing of Santander, which I hear rumors around that they seem to be pretty heavy-handed in some of the things that go on at Ferrari, like very much pushing for Carlos to do well as a Spanish driver, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how much truth there is to that, but those rumors, they get around. I think for Ferrari, though, a lot of why they choose the drivers they do is for protecting their image and putting on a good front for their brand. And I think they want to be seen as classy, high money, high fashion even, and protect this kind of old money image. So I think Charles and Carlos both fit pretty well into that image, and it's probably one of the reasons why Daniel Ricciardo's never driven for Ferrari. But yeah, I think Ferrari are going to stick with their drivers, and I just do not see any circumstance that changes unless their relationship completely implodes. Oh, my second driver pairing that I think is definitely going to stick together is McLaren. I have Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri. Now, the biggest threat to this driver pairing is if a spot opens up at, say, a Red Bull or a Mercedes. The longer the years go on and McLaren continues to struggle to put together a good car, I think those thoughts are going to start to creep into Lando's head of being like, can I actually win a championship with McLaren? He's still incredibly young, and I think he will have patience, but if McLaren starts to go backwards down the grid, I think that might be pretty worrying. The smart move is to stick it out. We've seen someone like Daniel make changes and it not work out, and so sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side. But if you're a number one driver in a team, at least you can kind of try and mold it to your preferences. I think Lando is going to be loyal to McLaren until they give him a reason why he shouldn't be. And Oscar, it's just his first year. I think he might have a little bit of an adjustment period, but I think he is going to be very strong, and I think McLaren will want to support him as much as they can. And McLaren's MO with their drivers is taking the best one available no matter the contracts that exist. You never know, if like Charles Leclerc miraculously became available, maybe they would swap out one of their drivers, because that's who Zach Brown is. But I just think that right now, I think they're pretty happy, and I don't know if they would want to pay to get out of another contract when they're still paying Daniel. So yeah. Next up, I have Aston Martin, and they are going to be sticking with Fernando Alonso and Lance Stroll. Stroll is there as long as his dad's there. That's not changing, and as much as they always like to fake us out with the, ooh, who's going to be the second driver? Because Lance hasn't signed a contract, even though his contract is literally like, I don't know if he even has a contract. He's just like his dad's son. It's just like, yeah, it's a bit silly. Like, no one knows how much he makes. Like, it's kind of wild. Fernando at this point, I think, has burned too many bridges to really go anywhere else. He's just bounced around the grid like no one else and constantly making poor decisions. So I'm hoping that this one works out for Fernando, and he seemed pretty happy at the car launch. So we'll see how that goes for him. The thing that Aston Martin seems to be most concerned about is having one driver on their team who's experienced, has a wealth of technical know-how to be able to develop the car in the direction that pushes them up the grid, until they get to a point where they can eventually pick a younger driver and make Lance their number one to get him to win the championship, even though I don't know if Lance has the talent to do that. So kind of interesting. So we'll see how Fernando does in this team this coming year, because he will be an excellent benchmark to know how good that car actually is. People also seem to think that there might be some tension between Fernando and Lance based on their personalities and kind of their relationships with their teammates in the past. I don't really see it for year one. I think it's going to be a similar situation to Alpine, where the first year Lance and Fernando are going to work really, really well together, and then year two, that's when they're going to start butting heads. So, yeah, I don't think I see anything changing there for 2024. Next up, I have Alpine. And Alpine's number one concern with their driver pairing is to make them as French as possible. And they've done that. They have the two French drivers on the grid in Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon. And I foresee this sticking together as well. The only concern here would be that they can't get over their drama in the past, and they butt heads way too often, and they just constantly crashing into each other. And you get a Esteban Sergio situation from 2018. I hope that they're professional enough not to let it get to that point, but you just never know with those French tempers. Well, I think Pierre's gonna have a bit of an adjustment period. He's coming in from Alpha Tauri, having driven for a Red Bull for his entire career, and so adjusting to the Alpine might take him a bit of time, but I do think he is a stronger driver than Esteban. If he's smart, he'll stick around for 2024 and then obliterate Esteban on the track, or at least try to. Esteban is a very consistent driver. He's been with that team for quite a few years now and knows kind of where they're going with development, and so I think he's good for continuity in terms of keeping that rolling. Next up, I have Mercedes, and I don't think George Russell is going anywhere anytime soon. He's their driver of the future. So the bigger question mark is, once again, Lewis Hamilton. I think that Lewis is for sure sticking around until he either wins his 8th championship, or you start to see him not be able to keep up with other drivers on the grid, because old age is unfortunately undefeated. But even if Lewis does win the championship, I still feel like he'll stick around. Looking at like the past few drivers who have retired in Seb and Kimi, it seems like the main reason they retired is because they have families and they have other things going on that they want to put more of their focus onto. But Lewis is just so busy all the time and managing so many different things already. He doesn't seem to need to leave F1 to do other things that he might want to do. Maybe he has some projects that he's had on the back burner, but I think nothing has been a priority really. And so I just don't get the sense that Lewis is like a Kimi or a Seb. I think he's going to stick around until it becomes evident that he can no longer race. I think he's going to go more so of a Michael Schumacher kind of way, where eventually it just becomes evident that he can't keep up with everyone else on the grid. But even Lewis is so fit, like, I don't know. Athletes seem to be able to compete at later ages in life, and Lewis is just one of a kind, and I honestly could just see him racing forever. Now again, one of the few things that could get in the way of George and Lewis's driver pairing is if they start to have inter-team conflict, because Mercedes' number one concern with their driver pairing is to have the best drivers available that do not butt heads, because they do not want another Lewis-Nico situation. So I don't think that Lewis and George will get like that. I think George is smart enough to know that he just needs to kind of stick it out until Lewis does decide to retire. As I just said, might not be for a while. But yeah, that's the only thing that could cause them to break apart. Next up, I have Haas. Now, Haas was interesting for me because I don't fully have faith that Nico is going to do a good job for them. I think he has proven to be a consistent point scorer in the past, but being out of F1 for 3 years, I don't really know where he's at. But Haas did sign him until 2024. I just do not see Haas ever breaking a contract because of the amount of money it would cost them, and they have always been reluctant to take on any unnecessary cost. So I think Nico will stick around. Kevin, on the other hand, his contract is up in 2023, but I just think that with the huge ground-swelling support that's going to come from his pole and Drive to Survive, I think they're going to re-sign him. I think they're pretty happy with how he's doing, unless, once again, they don't get along because they haven't in the past. That's the only thing that might break them apart, but even in that case, I feel like they would get rid of Nico before they would get rid of Kevin, even though Kevin's out of a contract. Next up is Alfa Romeo. And one of the seats here is pretty obvious. It's going to be Valtteri Bottas. He has done a good job of integrating into that team and helping push the development of the car. He has a lot of experience racing with Mercedes all those years and kind of knowing their winning ways and kind of what works and what doesn't. So I don't see him leaving. I think Valtteri probably wants to stick around once Audi takes over. However, that's one question that I have is, do they see him as a driver that can take them into the Audi era? And that I'm not too sure about. So I think Alfa Romeo's concern now is, yes, they want to develop the car, but I think they also want to develop a driver that they can turn into their number one or a future world champion if they think that they can make a car good enough to do that. So I went back and forth on the second seat because Zhou Guanyu's out of a contract for 2023. So I think that seat really depends on how Théo Pourchaire does in F2. I think if Théo wins F2, it's going to be a very, very, very difficult decision. But Théo is also still very, very young, and so I don't know if Alfa Romeo will want to risk putting him in the car even if he does win F2. So I have Zhou Guanyu sticking around for another year, partially because I don't think there's too many other options of drivers moving going into 2024. But however, I think at the end of 2024, that's when things are really going to open up because there's so many spots available on top teams that are going to open up. And so I think we're going to get a lot of driver transfers for that year, but not necessarily this year. So I think they'll stick around with Zhou as they're still in this car development phase, and then they might switch to Théo after the coming year. Next up is Red Bull. And obviously Max Verstappen is sticking around. He has a contract with them until 2028. I really don't see him even losing the championship until 2026 at this point. So Max is just locked in to that Red Bull seat. And the other seat, I think, is going to Daniel Ricciardo. The more and more I think about this, the more it makes sense. Red Bull's number one concern with their driver pairing is partially to have good drivers, but a big factor for them is marketability, because Red Bull is first and foremost an energy drink company. And so they want someone who can sit in those seats as an athlete, similar to all of the other athletes that represent their brand, to sell energy drinks. And when you're looking at Daniel Ricciardo versus Checo Perez, there's no comparison. Daniel is far superior in marketability, and that is something that he has managed to turn into such an asset for himself, mainly through Drive to Survive and being basically the face of that show, and also just becoming extremely popular in America, which is where I think all the teams we're going to see in the coming years are going to try and want to fight to be the number one American team, even though you have a Haas and you might have an Andretti coming in. I think they want the market share in America, and having Daniel on your team is going to help a lot with that. But looking on the performance side of things, I think another reason why Red Bull will want to look at Daniel is that looking at the teammates that he's had over the past few years, Checo has gotten closest to Max, but one thing that you can kind of see is as they develop the car towards Max's liking, it gets further and further away from a car that Checo was comfortable with. We saw that last year with how he was really strong at the start of the year, but as they developed the car, Checo didn't perform as well. I think Daniel has a much more similar driving style to Max. They both like a pointy front end. And so I think if they're looking at this, they're going to say, in the past, Daniel was able to be very close to Max. Max would still outqualify him on most occasions, at least kind of by the end of 2018, but at least they were close. Their relationship is great. It deteriorated a little bit in 2018, but I think they're both a lot more mature now and should be able to handle the pressures that come along with racing together. And I don't really think that the performance gap between Checo and Daniel is going to be all that big. I mean, Checo's clearly currently likely the better driver, just because Daniel has struggled for so many years in that McLaren and probably has a lack of confidence right now, and so he'll have to build that back up. But I think that's part of the reason why this year he has joined them behind the scenes and just doing the sim racing. He's just trying to build himself back up to the driver that he knows he can be. And then of course, also falling into this marketability, Red Bull struggled with PR after Daniel left. How they treated Pierre Gasly, how they treated Alex, how they've been treating Checo, it really started to bring into this negative kind of attention swirling around the team. And as soon as they bring Daniel back, you got all of this positive energy coming their way, and Daniel's just a positive beacon wherever he goes. And so Red Bull is kind of using Daniel as much as Daniel is using Red Bull. So I don't know, there's just so many things that are making me realize how much this makes sense. I really hope that Checo can find a seat for 2024 if this happens, but I don't know. I just think it makes sense. Even though Red Bull could probably have their pick of the litter of other drivers on the grid, like a Lando or someone else, but I just think that they're going to want to bring back Max Seal. They're going to want to do it. And so that's why I have Max Verstappen and Daniel Ricciardo for 2024 at Red Bull. The next driver pairing is Williams. Now, Williams last year took them a very long time to pick out a second driver. Logan didn't get that seat until Abu Dhabi after he was able to get his super license. And so they are not afraid to wait for a while. I think Alex currently is signed with them till, I think they said a multi-year contract when he signed his contract. So at least 2024 is what I'm thinking that means. So I think he will stick around, and I think that's a smart idea because I think he's trying to make Williams his team, and he seems pretty happy with the direction the car is going as well. So things are looking up for Alex, and I think he's going to want to stick around at Williams. But the second seat there, I just think that if Williams have an opportunity to sign a race-winning driver, they will do it. So I have Sergio Perez taking the second seat at Williams. And if it's not him, then it's going to be Daniel. I think one of the two of them are going to take that seat because I think Williams are going to want to have a driver, even if it's just for a year, who can develop that car and get them back to a winning outfit. Because for the past few years, Williams' number one concern has been just to survive and make money. Because they haven't been at a state to do anything else. But I'm hoping that if they can start to turn things around and get the energy moving in a more positive direction, the outlook will brighten for them. And the final driver pairing is Alpha Tauri. And I really struggled with Alpha Tauri because it's a bit ambiguous what the purpose of the team is now. In the past, it was to develop drivers for the Red Bull team. Well, I think that's still one of their primary concerns. With Max in that top team, it just doesn't seem like that's as necessary. I don't have faith in either of their drivers for 2023. And so I have both of them leaving. I think one of the two drivers that they're going to bring in is going to be whoever performs the best in F2, because I think they have at least 5 drivers in F2 who are Red Bull juniors. And so at least one of them has got to do well. So my bet for the 5 of them would be Dennis Hauger. I'm still not super familiar with a lot of the junior drivers, but I think he seems to have that good mix of experience and also past winning pedigree that I think will be appealing to Red Bull and to AlphaTauri. And the second driver I think is going to be Liam Lawson. I think all of the other F2 drivers are still a little bit too young, and I think Red Bull has kind of learned their lesson about promoting drivers too early when they might not be ready, both in their experiences with Pierre and Alex, as well as Yuki, because they promoted Yuki into an F1 seat very, very quickly. And while Yuki has the pace, it took him a while and is still taking him a while to have that Formula One mindset. Now, Liam Lawson, though, was also a struggle for me to really put here, because part of me thinks that why wouldn't they have put him in the AlphaTauri seat for 2023 when they went with Nick de Vries instead? And I don't really know. But Liam Lawson is still part of their junior program. I think he's driving in Super Formula this year. He's still going to be a reserve driver for them. So I'm just thinking that if Nick isn't up to snuff, they might want another more experienced driver in that seat to try and see if he has what it takes to be a future second driver to Max. Because I think that's kind of what AlphaTauri is now, is like testing out all of these different drivers to see if any of them stick and can take over from Checo. But I don't know, there hasn't been a truly obvious prospect in a while, apart from Oscar Piastri. So I don't really know what's happening there, and I truly think that AlphaTauri is probably going to be sold to another team within the next couple years. And my number one thought for this is F1 is tendering applications for new teams. I'm guessing there's going to be more than 2, which is the number that are available. And so if there's a really strong contender for a team that doesn't manage to get in through as a new team, they're probably going to want to buy a team, and I think AlphaTauri is probably the most likely culprit there. But anyways, those are my predictions for the 2024 driver pairings. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you think that Daniel will be taking a Red Bull seat for 2024, or even before then, or not at all? See you guys next week when things are really starting to pick up and Drive to Survive's coming out soon. We got testing, we have all the livery reveals will be done, and the first race is just a couple weeks away. So see you in a bit.